Hello everybody, I'm Roxy and this is Chaotic Bibliophile. I am so excited to finally be making this video. Today I want to share with you 5 Chilean authors that are writing today around the world, being published and being translated into English so you can check them out. A bit of quick context. I threw around the idea of this video in my diverse reading video, linked down below and in the eye as always. In that video, I talked about the importance of translation and of broadening our ideas of what diverse reading is. I have since rewatched this video and honestly, it's not my best edited piece. It's a bit messy and I apologize, but I still think the points stand and are relevant, so feel free to check it out after this video. In that video, I asked you if you would be interested in me pointing you towards Chilean literature and Latin American literature, and a lot of you said yes. I did research for this video. I looked into these authors, all of whom I've read and enjoyed, but I wanted to give you a bit more context and talk about their themes, and I also looked up every single book that has been translated into English by them. Before we start, a couple of caveats. You'll notice the conspicuous absence of Pedro Lemebel, who's one of my favorite authors of all time, who wrote My Tender Matador, which I'm sure you're tired of hearing me talk about. I'm going to link my favorite fiction reads of 2020 where you can hear me talk about it in depth. I'm not going to include him here, however, because first I want to talk about living authors that you may be able to follow in the upcoming years, but also because Pedro Lemebel is a classic. I know for a lot of people, certain time frame is important, but Pedro Lemebel has acquired such an icon status both in the literary world as in the pop culture world, just general Chilean and specifically LGBT plus culture. His books are studied and analyzed. When I get to make my video on classic books that you can read, then I will definitely mention Pedro Lemebel. My second caveat is that probably if you follow translated prizes, you will know some of these names. I, of course, could recommend more obscure authors, but they are not translated into English, which is something I hope to have a say in one day, maybe. But for now, these are the authors. And I'm thinking of actually doing the reverse search. So search first for books that have been translated into English and then see if I want to read those. The other way around is a bit challenging, so that was an important factor because I do want you to be able to access these books. And the third, not caveat, just to let you know the structure of this video, I have time-stamped each author. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, their themes, and then finally tell you about all the books that have been translated and briefly review the ones that I've read. So let's start. The first one is perhaps the most well-known and you've probably heard about him, and he's Alejandro Zambra. He's definitely one of the most important literary writers in Chile. He's also very active in the literary community. It sounds like it's obvious, but not necessarily, but in his case, he's met many hip relevant authors from all around the world. He is married to Jazmina Barrera, which is something I only learned recently, and he's also close friends with Valeria Luiselli. He's like a cool literary author. He was born in 1975. He began his career as more of a poet. He also early on began writing about literature. He studied literature and then did his PhD at my alma mater. Just a little data there. And actually, I think his undergrad was done in the university I transferred from to my alma mater. So although he studied the Spanish language equivalent of my major, which is more English translation and education focused. So that is irrelevant for you. I just wanted to share that. Anyways, he has won tons of awards. He has been published everywhere. Granta, the Paris Review, the New Yorker, you name it, he's been there. And I've had a kind of a roller coaster-y relationship with him. I loved Multiple Choice by him. We'll get to that in a second. I then loved the second novel I read by him. Didn't like the third novel. not at all, like it's still well written, but I thought that maybe he had exhausted everything he had for me. That sounds very pretentious for me, but it sometimes happens with authors. And then his latest release, which I haven't yet read, and it hasn't been translated to English just yet, although I think it will get translated, sounds very similar to the one that I didn't like, which is why I haven't wanted to read it. However, I recently read Not to Read by him, which is a collection of his columns, and I completely fell in love with him again. His themes, that is very important. He's a very literary author in terms of he loves books, he loves reading, he loves literature, capital L. Of course, his books have a lot to do with writing, with literature, with authors. They are very existential and the function of literature in our lives, politics and the everyday. So how education and politics and history factor into our everyday. He also writes quite a bit about relationships and loneliness, and there is a lot of humor to be found in his work. He tends to write very succinctly. His novels are very short for the most part. So let's see what's been translated by him. The first novel was translated in 2008. It's Bonsai. It was translated by Carolina de Robertus and published by Melville House Publishing. Yes, I wrote this down. I'm sorry. But look, I even highlighted the ones I've read. I've done my homework. Bonsai was the second novel I read by him, and I really liked it at the time. I don't know if I'd like it now, so it's very important to me to reread it before I make up my mind, but it was good. It's about a young man and a young woman. They are university students. They read to each other. Bonsai is a metaphor materialized because there's an actual bonsai tree, and it's about their care, and it's sort of a very obvious, but I thought at the time very cleverly and delicately done comparison. For me, it was kind of an introduction to this sort of non-fiction-y fragmented fiction where they give you random information. Again, I don't know if I'd love it now, but at the time I thought it was quite good. The second book that was translated by him was a book that put me off him for some time, and it was The Private Lives of Trees. It was translated in 2010 by Megan McDowell, and it was published by Open Letter Books. I am going to say right now that Megan McDowell, I am now following her on Twitter, has translated so many of these books. She is now Alejandro Zambra's, I think, official translator. She is just a very big champion of Chilean literature. I don't know if this is by choice or it was just life. I want to know more about her. This is a sort of continuation of Bonsai. It felt very self-pitying. It's too close perspective to a mediocre guy, and yeah, it wasn't interesting enough to feel for the guy. You can do mediocre guy narratives well, but because they have been prevalent for so long, let's say, it's a common theme, you need to elevate them somehow, and this was not elevated. But I liked some aspects of it, especially with the main character being a stepdad, but sort of, because he's not married to the mom. I don't remember if they're living together or not, but it's still sort of solidifying and what happens when there is a daughter in between. So that was interesting, but yeah, I am not a big fan of that novel. Then Ways of Going Home, 2013, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, or is it Giroux? You know what publisher I'm talking about. I haven't read this yet. I've heard not the best things, but there is another novel that you can check out. Then My Documents, published in 2015 by McSweeney's. This is a collection of short stories, and I am eager to read it. I am this close to either buying it or checking it out from the library, but I have so many books, and Alejandro Zambra's books are not hard to get, so but I'm thinking about it. Okay, moving on. Then there is Multiple Choice, which was published in 2016 by Penguin Books. This is an experimental sort of novel. You can also read it as a short story collection if you'd like. It basically imitates the former university entrance exam, specifically for, we call it language now. It means Spanish, as in literature and communication. It uses the format to analyze Chilean education and history. It focuses a lot on the years of the dictatorship, but also its legacy. During the dictatorship, there were a lot of educational reforms that some people think were positive, but effectively made public education worse and private education more expensive. It's a very interesting book. These tests carry a lot of weight for us because your more traditional Anglophone countries, and maybe other countries as well, I don't know, selection system where it's not only the university entrance exams, but there's essays and interviews and they get to know you, that sort of thing is the exception here, not the rule. And the regular way of entering university is only through these tests. Now that has been sort of balanced with grades from school and your place within your cohort at school. But at the time of Zambra's studying and writing this book, that wasn't the case. It's a whole thing. I think it works. I think it stands to multiple rereads. Even if you know the gimmick, I think the content is still beautifully put and significant enough that even in this strange format, you can just read it a lot. And finally, Not to Read, published in 2018 by Fitzcarraldo Editions. I don't own anything by them, which I think is kind of sad, but I deeply admire their work. Anyways, these are collections of essays, lectures, and columns. The columns are the majority of it. They are fabulous. I read them recently. Of course, my edition is a bit different because they've changed a lot of the contents, but still fascinating. In here, you see the extent of Zambra's cleverness and love for literature, but also he doesn't take anything too serious except the books, and I love that. He makes fun of himself, other authors, of things readers do. It's wonderful and I really recommend it. If you read in Spanish, I wrote a little piece about this and another book for our website I'm writing for, so you can check it down below. It's about books that make you want to keep reading other books. So that was Alejandro Zambra for you. The next author I want to tell you about is Nona Fernández, who was born in 1971. She is a very interesting author that I've only started reading recently, although she's always been in the back of my mind. She is actually an actor, playwright, and short story writer, also a screenwriter, and she's written for a lot of very famous series. They're kind of telenovelas, but they are their own thing. They follow different conventions. I was very impressed when I saw the list. She's won lots of awards. I think compared to Alejandro Zambra, who is a bit more of an author of the world. His novels are often set in Santiago, but it's more of the city as an entity, whereas Nona Fernández writes explicitly of Chile much more tangibly, and that's very fascinating. She is well known, but not often hailed as Zambra, which, you know, grants wonder why that might be. She deserves much more praise than she gets. Not that she doesn't get a lot, but she deserves even more. So her themes, she talks a lot about family, memory, collective identity versus individual identity, and memory, how these things are often in tension and contradict each other. She is very experimental, but in a way that's very playful, and that, from what I read, always works. She's very intelligent with her metaphors. Oh, she's very intertextual in her works. A lot of her books also talk about the dictatorship and politics in general. I loved her from the beginning. The first book that I read by her was Frequently Asked Questions, which was her 2020 Pandemonium book, which was a curious introduction because, of course, it was a book that was very hastily written, but at the same time, and I attended an online event with her discussing this. One of the narrative threads of the story she had been thinking about for a long time, and she sort of said it during these times. So maybe that's why it doesn't feel half-baked. My respects. However, that hasn't yet been translated. Actually, there are only 2 books translated by her, which I think is sad. I think they should translate Chilean Electric, definitely. Yes, it's very Chilean, but I think the metaphor of electricity and the personal history and even immigration and memory, I think they work so well. Please translate that. Anyways, Space Invaders was published in 2019. It was translated by Natasha, I want to say Wimmer, but maybe Wimmer, and was published by Grey Wolf Press, which is a wonderful press. I really admire their work. I already reviewed this. I loved it. Basically, it's about the dictatorship in Chile as seen from the perspective of different children. They are all classmates, but you can tell their parents have very different stances in relation to the dictatorship, and that is what's interesting to see how children absorb these ideas and also how they think about them years down the road. There is one very distinct voice that is recalling what it was like to grow up during those times. The book is actually called Space Invaders in Spanish because it refers to the game. I think the metaphor there is pretty clear, but once again, it works so well. And then a book that I haven't read, The Twilight Zone, which was only recently translated. I think it already came out. It's a 2021 book. It was also translated by Natasha Wimmer and also published by Grey Wolf Press. You can see she works a lot with ideas of colonization and cultural colonization. I just can't wait for more of her work to be translated, but I will certainly read more by her, so she will pop up in this channel from time to time. Yeah, I'm so happy. Number 3 is one that, again, I've heard so much about and I had read once, but I started with the wrong book and I wasn't that impressed, and I actually talked about her in this channel way back when, before the channel was a regular thing that I did, and that is Lina Meruane. She was born in 1870. She is of Palestinian and Italian descent, and she has a book that sadly is not translated into English called something like To Become Palestinian, where she talks about that aspect of her identity. She has, of course, won a lot of awards. She also teaches Latin American literature at NYU. I don't know if she still does in 2021. She's also a cultural journalist and she has a lot of essays. She's also the founder of Brutas Editoras, which is an indie publisher that publishes mainly books out of Santiago and Manhattan. Of course, New York, being New York, has a really strong Latin American literary scene. So themes, she's a bit different from the other two. I think she's a much more intimate author. She is very interested in the grotesque and the body and that sort of intimate experiences that sometimes can be so tender but can also be so brutal and scary. She writes a lot about the female experience in general, and she also writes about a condition she has in her eyes, and that is actually the topic of her first book that is translated, which is called Seeing Red. It was published in 2016. It was translated by Megan McDowell and published by Deep Vellum. I haven't wrapped this book up yet because I only recently finished it. It's wonderful. So as I said, it's an autofictional tale of a woman called Lina Meruane who suffers from a condition where the blood vessels in her eyes sort of pop and they just fill with blood, and she cannot see, of course. It goes into both the frightening experience of not being able to see, but also living with it, also how other people react to it, because she lives in, I want to say New York, I think so, but in any case, the States. And she's living there with a serious boyfriend, but they are not married yet, I think. And she comes back to Chile for a time and her family wants her to have the operation there. It's very interesting because it's not jammed in there, it's just part of the narrative. But of course, it's a very resonant topic of being an expat that is still in strong contact, especially nowadays where you can call and travel relatively cheaply and easily, but of course she has this condition to think about. So it's a myriad of things. It's written in a very stream of consciousness way. I think if Virginia Woolf were alive and reading today, she would love this book. She would think it's so interesting, but it's much more raw than a Virginia Woolf book. Less afraid to go to the dirty, ugly bits. As I said, Lina Meruane works a lot with the grotesque, and actually the first book I read by her, the one that I didn't love so much, was fairy tale inspired. I don't think that's a topic she necessarily goes back to in later works, but you can see the grotesque as an aesthetic function and a chance for self-discovery that is so fairy tale-esque in her work. She recently released a collection of 3 essays called Blind Spot. That is my translation. It's not translated to English just yet. Those are essays in conversation with this autofictional piece, and I really want to read them. I've already acquired them. The other book that I have not yet read, but I really want to, and I have it on hold at the library, is Nervous System, which I'm not sure has already come out or not because it's a 2021 release. Again, translated by Megan McDowell, but this time published by Grey Wolf Press. If it's not out, it will be out soon. It's her other major work, and I would sincerely recommend you check it out. If anyone wants to check it out, please do let me know. Maybe we can schedule a buddy read or something. Number 4 is Carla Guelfenbein, or Bein. I have never heard her pronounce her last name, so I wouldn't know, but in Chile, we tend to pronounce the Ein names of German and similar descent as just Ein. So I'm gonna go with Guelfenbein. She is a new to me author. I only became aware of her because I was actually redeeming points at a local indie bookstore, and I found one of her books and it sounded interesting. I am going to talk about this book right now. That's how I came across her. And then I found out she was translated when I was doing research for this video. I was like, oh, perfect then. She was born in 1959 and started publishing later in life. She started publishing when she was 40, which is an interesting contrast in comparison to all of these wunderkinds I have been talking about, not only here in Chile, but of course in publishing in general, but speaking specifically of the Chilean context. There is a tendency to exalt young, hip voices, and I think that is in part as a resistance to the Chilean literary canon, which was always so out of touch with reality in so many ways. Not all of it, of course, I'm generalizing, but the idea of literary establishment as being so far away from what people actually read and consume, that I think there's a lot of emphasis in young people writing the now and writing today. And of course, they are also the ones who are writing about the enduring sequels of the dictatorship. But I also think it's important to give chances to new authors that are older. You can start doing something later in life and still be very good at it. It shouldn't need to be said, but it needs to be said. Anyways, Carla Guelfenbein. Her themes are a lot about Chilean history, but not so much recent history necessarily as history in general. She also talks a lot about women and women's history and interpersonal relationships. The first book that I now really want to read, I didn't know of this book before I read the other book and began doing research for this video. It's called The Rest is Silence. It was published in 2011. It was translated by Catherine Silver, who translated My Tender Matter and did a terrific job according to my sources. It was published by Granta Books, and that makes me so happy that Granta took that chance. Then the following was translated in 2018. It's called In the Distance with You, translated by John Cullen and published by Other Press, another great publisher. And finally, the one that I've read is One in Me I Never Loved, which is forthcoming. It's going to be out in November 2021. It was translated by Neil Davidson and again published by Other Press. I feel so hip talking about a new release that hasn't come out yet. I mean, what is this channel becoming? Am I going to start following prices now? Am I going to start talking about new exciting releases? Likely not. That is not who I am, but I do feel very hip in this particular case. This was something I thought was a short story collection, but it's actually a novel. It's about 3 different women. I think actually there are 4, but one of them is not so much an active protagonist as much as part of another story's narrative, although it must be said all of these women's stories are interconnected through time and space. It opens with Margarita, I think is her name, don't quote me on that, but it opens with a woman who is living in New York with her husband, and he is a teacher at Colombia, so he's very important, and she feels she abandoned too much of her life in Chile to go with him, and now not even their marriage is that good, and she fantasizes that she catches him cheating, because at least that means that there is some passion somewhere and they would fight and something would happen. And that is interspersed with a very interesting storyline of Doris Dana, who was Gabriela Mistral's lover. I don't know if you understand any of those words, but basically, Chilean poet Gabriela Mistral was the first Chilean to ever win a Nobel Prize. She is a wonderful poet, but she was also a very interesting educator and education theorist, and she was always very much a children's rights advocate, and she was a lesbian. She has now become an icon of good quality education, an icon of LGBT plus organizations here. I actually have the Bibliophile Daily episode all on her, so I will link that down below in case you want to find out more. So her most important and most long-lasting relationship was with this young woman, Doris Dana, an artist and translator in the New York scene, and Carla Guelfenbein, who is the author I'm talking about right now, takes this story and it talks about the earlier days of their relationship, because Doris has another relationship at the time. She is in a relationship with one of her friends, but it's a very not committed relationship, and she's thinking about what she wants to do with her life. And here is this poet who is so vibrant and so passionate and writes these beautiful letters to her. She is a very important figure in the college where the other protagonist, Margarita, goes to think, and she starts untangling a mystery of a disappearing woman. I am not explaining this very well, but it's a fascinating book. It's a very short book. It's not the most intricate book, but it's very well written, and I love that it's about women with women in them, and it has so many different types of female experience. I actually really recommend it. It's a good time. I think if you like, for example, Alice Munro, you can maybe really appreciate this book. Finally, I want to talk about Alejandra Costamagna. She was born in 1970, and she actually studied journalism, not literature, which is not far off, but is interesting because you can see the influence of journalism in her writing, especially in the book that I'm going to discuss today. She was very well reviewed by Roberto Bolaño. Roberto Bolaño actually championed a lot of, at the time, up-and-coming young female authors, and I didn't know about that. I don't have the best relationship writing-wise with Roberto Bolaño, but I am going to give him more opportunities, so look forward to that. In any case, Alejandra Costamagna was well reviewed by him. Anyway, she writes mostly short stories and novels, and she attended the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa, which I don't know if you know this. You probably do. It's like one of the most prestigious Anglophone writing programs. I don't know if the international program is necessarily in English, but you know, University of Iowa writing programs are a big deal. And in relation to that, just like a very asterisky note I want to mention is that I am happy that these authors are in translation, of course, but it bothers me a bit how extraordinary an author needs to be translated. Either they need to be bestsellers or they need to be literary award winners. And I did say that in my diversity reading video, that there are a lot of other genre literature that I would love if it was translated, because they also can tell you a lot about society. Maybe I don't read them, maybe they are not my genre, but they are other people's genre in different languages, and I think they should be more readily translated, because the opposite is true. A lot of genre fiction from English that is not even very good gets translated, but suddenly books that are not written in English, especially from smaller countries, very high quote unquote, need to be extraordinary in order to be translated. And I think that's bad. That's unfair. Also because it gives translated fiction this air of unattainability, of it being hyper intellectual, and not all literature is that. I would love it if people who read romance, for example, had access to truly diverse reads, meaning in translation. In any case, that was just a note. Themes. So she also writes a lot about memory, but also immigration, heritage, ideas of identity. She has a very fragmentary style because of, I assume, her journalism roots. I own a book by her that I have not yet read that is supposed to talk about Santiago's transformations throughout the decades through language and highlight that. She harps a lot on words themselves. And that can totally be seen in The Touch System, the book that has only recently been published. It's a 2021 release as well. It was translated by Lisa Dillman and published by Transit Books. This is a fragmentary, let's call it novel. I have yet to wrap it up once again. It's about many things, but mainly a young woman who is Chilean. It talks about her since childhood. It kind of jumps back and forth, and we're not only in her eyes. It's almost like a collection of documents, and it includes pictures that are actually family pictures of Costamagna's family. There's also a game there with typewriters. It's a whole thing, and actually the name The Touch System is a reference to a machine writing system. I don't know the technical word in English, but you know that discipline when you learn to type fast and easily. Anyways, there is this young girl who is Chilean but was taken to live in Argentina for some time, and then she went back, and she also had a sort of cousin there whose perspective is really important. It talks about her parents and the family ties and what it means to be Chilean, what it means to be Argentinian. Since always, but especially during that time, there was the South Patagonia conflict, so that is also part of it, but it's not the main thing. I think you need to like reading books that are not necessarily stories. If you're looking for a story, there is one there, and I'm actually in awe that Alejandra Costamagna managed to make it so coherent for something that is as fragmented, but it's still not an arc, and it doesn't feel like the characters change much. It's pretty much a reflection. If you like creative essays, although this is somewhat fictional, I think that is the demographic that this will appeal most to. Those are the 5 authors I wanted to tell you about today. I am going to continue making these videos, of course not regularly, but the promotion of Chilean contemporary literature and Chilean literature in general and Latin American literature in general is something I now feel very strongly about. I myself have had a very tumultuous, that sounds very dramatic, but complex relationship with my mother tongue, with ideas of language and literature. But in my last few years of high school and my first year of uni, I really read a lot of Chilean literature, and then I stopped, and it's only been in recent years where I've gotten back in touch with my roots, let's call it. Of course, I live here, so you can ask yourselves, how is that possible? Well, I'm not going to go into it here, but it's a thing. The point is that I have now gone back to actively follow contemporary Chilean literature. Couldn't be happier. We have such a vibrant scene. There are also so many up and coming, fascinating Chilean and Latin American authors writing in all sorts of tones and genres, and I'm very excited to share that with you as much as I can. That is why I don't make separate wrap-ups for books that aren't translated. I do put timestamps because I think they are useful, but I hope that even if you cannot read these books, you will hear about them, you can learn about them. I myself, when booktubers I follow talk about books in other languages, I never skip them, even if I can't read them, because I think it's fascinating, and who knows, maybe one day they'll get translated. So I think it's important to engage with literature even if we can't read it. Again, Of course, for these videos, I'm going to always look for books that are translated. There is one devoted to classics coming. There is one devoted to Latin American authors coming, but it will take me a while because I like to make these thoughtful, or as thoughtful as I can. I've been talking for so long, but for once I don't feel that exhausted. I feel happy, joyful, exuberant. These are all authors that I deeply enjoy, and I am so happy to be bringing more of my history and my present and my background to this channel. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you will give them a chance, and that's it. If you have any comments or questions or requests, please leave them down below and let's have a conversation. Also, if you are in the mood to do so, please tell me an author that resonates with you in an identity level. It doesn't have to be necessarily because they share the same identity, just something that reminds you about something in yourself that perhaps you had forgotten or that you didn't know you treasured so much about yourself. Someone that made you feel seen through their writing for one reason or another. I would be curious and delighted to find out. So please comment that down below. So that's all for today. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to check out my social media and my other platforms, everything is linked down below. See you next time. I was it's her otter